In all his years of television, Steve Harvey had never seen a man look at an audience the way James Thompson was looking at that crowd. It wasn't the usual scanning for familiar faces or the nervous glance of someone hoping their friends were watching. It was something else entirely. Something that made Steve pause mid-sentence during his opening banter, his comedian's instinct recognizing a story beneath the surface. James Thompson stood at the family podium, 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that never quite leaves a military man, and his eyes kept drifting to the back rows, searching, almost haunted, like he was looking for ghosts, or maybe hoping he wouldn't find them. The studio was electric with the usual pre-game energy. The Thompson family on one side, James, his wife Rachel, their teenage daughter Emma, his brother Marcus, and his mother Dorothy. The opposing family on the other, all smiles and enthusiasm. 300 audience members settling into their seats, cameras in position, lights blazing, everything normal, everything routine. Just another episode of Family Feud on a Wednesday afternoon in October. But if you had been watching James Thompson closely, if you had noticed the way his jaw tightened every few seconds, the way his hand kept reaching for something that wasn't there anymore, the way his breathing looked just a little too controlled, you might have sensed that this man was carrying something heavier than the hope of winning a game show. You might have recognized the particular way trauma sits in a body, quiet and persistent, like a low-grade fever that never quite breaks. Steve Harvey, master of reading a room, felt it before he understood it. He had that gift, the ability to sense when someone needed more than laughter, when the script needed to be abandoned, when being a host meant being human first. And something about James Thompson was setting off every one of those instincts. What Steve didn't know, what James didn't know, was that 4 men were sitting in the audience with their hearts in their throats. 4 men who had flown in from Virginia, Texas, Arizona, and North Carolina. 4 men who hadn't seen each other in nearly 20 years, but who knew each other's voices in the dark, who could still remember the exact sound of each other's breathing during the long desert nights when staying awake meant staying alive. 4 men who had been boys together in hell, and who had spent 2 decades trying to forget what they couldn't forget and forgive themselves for surviving what others hadn't. The producers knew. They had orchestrated this with military precision, coordinating flights and hotel rooms and absolute secrecy. They had watched James Thompson's audition tape, heard the way his voice changed when he mentioned his service, saw the shadow that passed across his face when someone asked if he stayed in touch with his unit. They had done their research, tracked down the men who had served with him, and asked a question that seemed impossible. Would you come to Los Angeles to surprise a brother you haven't seen in 20 years? All 4 had said yes before the question was even finished. Because some bonds don't break, some connections survive time and distance, and trauma and silence. Some love is forged in fire so intense that it becomes permanent, molecular, woven into the very fabric of who you are. And sometimes, just sometimes, healing requires only one thing: seeing the faces of the people who understand. The ones who were there, the ones who know. The game was about to start. The clock was ticking. Steve Harvey was adjusting his tie, preparing to be entertaining, to be funny, to give America the show they tuned in for. He had no idea that in less than 15 minutes, he would be standing in the middle of something that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with redemption. That he would witness grown men collapse into each other's arms. That he would hear words that had been waiting 20 years to be spoken. That he would understand, perhaps for the first time, what it really means when someone says, "I would die for you." The stage manager called for quiet. The red lights blinked on. And somewhere in the back of the audience, 4 men who had survived war together held their breath and waited. This is that story. James Thompson had enlisted in the Army 3 days after his 20th birthday. It was 2001, and the world was different then, or maybe it was the same, and he was just young enough to believe he could make a difference. He had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania where everyone knew everyone, where Friday nights meant high school football and Sunday mornings meant church, where the future felt both infinite and limited at the same time. The military offered something he couldn't quite name: purpose, adventure, a way to matter. He shipped out to Iraq for his first tour in 2003. 2nd Squad, 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company. 12 men whose names became more familiar than his own family's. Rodriguez, who could make everyone laugh, even when the temperature hit 120 degrees. Chen, who received letters from his grandmother every single week and read them aloud to anyone who would listen. Martinez, barely 19, who kept a photograph of his newborn daughter taped inside his helmet. Washington, the medic, who had hands steady enough to perform miracles with whatever supplies they had. And Kowalski, the quiet one, who could fix anything mechanical and wrote poetry in a notebook he thought no one knew about. They were brothers in the way only soldiers understand. Not related by blood, but by something deeper, by shared fear and shared courage, by the knowledge that every morning might be your last, and that the man next to you would die trying to make sure it wasn't. They ate together, slept in shifts, joked about things that would sound insane to anyone who hadn't been there. They became experts at reading each other's moods, at knowing when someone needed to talk and when they needed silence. James served 3 tours. 36 months total in a country that felt like another planet. And in those 36 months, he lost 5 men from his squad. 5 brothers who left in body bags while he came home on a plane. 5 funerals he attended, wearing his dress uniform, standing at attention while families wept for sons and husbands and fathers who would never walk through their doors again. The guilt was immediate and permanent. Why them and not me? The question became a mantra, a prayer, a curse. It followed him home, invaded his sleep, sat across from him at the dinner table. He tried therapy. He tried medication. He tried talking about it and not talking about it. He tried staying busy, and he tried sitting still. Nothing worked, because nothing could answer the question that haunted him. What right did he have to be alive when they weren't? The other survivors, Rodriguez, Chen, Martinez, Washington, and Kowalski, scattered after they returned home. They had promised to stay in touch, exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, swore they would meet up every year. But within 6 months, the calls stopped, not because they didn't love each other, but because they did. Because every conversation was a reminder. Because seeing each other meant remembering. Because sometimes the people who understand you best are also the people you can't bear to face. James tried to move forward. He married Rachel, a teacher he met at a friend's barbecue who saw through his walls and loved him anyway. They had Emma, who inherited her father's quiet strength and her mother's compassion. He worked construction, using his hands to build things because destroying things was what war had taught him, and he needed to remember he could create. He showed up for soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. He grilled on weekends and took his family camping. He looked, from the outside, like a man who had healed. But Rachel knew better. She saw the way he startled at loud noises, the way he couldn't sleep through the night, the way certain dates on the calendar, anniversaries of attacks, birthdays of fallen brothers, turned him into a ghost of himself. She saw him sometimes, late at night, scrolling through old photographs on his phone, his face illuminated by the blue glow, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. "You should reach out to them," she would say gently. "The ones who made it. They'd want to hear from you." But James always shook his head. What would I even say? What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Rodriguez, Chen, Martinez, and Washington were asking themselves the same question. That they each carried the same guilt, the same midnight thoughts, the same desperate wish that they could go back and save the ones they couldn't save. That they had each independently tried to find the courage to call James and couldn't quite manage it. That they thought about him constantly, wondered if he was okay, hoped he had found some measure of peace. 20 years. 7,300 days of carrying weight that no one should have to carry alone. Of living with memories that felt too big for one person to hold. Of surviving when survival felt like the cruelest gift. But today, on this Wednesday afternoon in October, on a game show stage in Los Angeles, that was about to change. Because 4 men had gotten on planes. 4 men had decided that 20 years was long enough. 4 men were sitting in an audience, watching their brother stand on stage, and preparing to do the thing they should have done a long time ago. Show up. The game began with Steve Harvey's signature energy. All right, all right, all right. We got the Thompson family from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The audience erupted in applause. And we got the Rodriguez family from... He stopped mid-sentence. his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the opposing team's name card. Rodriguez. His gaze flickered to James, then back to his cards. Something in his expression shifted, but he continued smoothly. From San Antonio, Texas. The first round went normally. Standard questions, standard answers. The Thompsons were good, coordinated, supportive of each other, playing with the kind of unity that comes from genuine affection. Emma, the teenage daughter, was nervous but sweet. Rachel was strategic and calm. Marcus, James's brother, brought energy and humor. Dorothy, the mother, had that grandmotherly wisdom that made even wrong answers seem charming. But it was James who held Steve's attention. The team captain stood at the podium with military bearing back straight, hands clasped, eyes forward. But there was something in his stillness that felt less like confidence and more like control. The kind of rigid composure that comes from years of training yourself not to fall apart. During a commercial break, Steve walked over to the Thompson family. He did this, sometimes checked in, built rapport, looked for stories. But this time, it felt different. He positioned himself directly in front of James, his comedian's mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine curiosity. "James, my man," Steve said casually, "you got an interesting energy about you. You military?" James nodded. "Yes, sir. Army. 3 tours in Iraq." The studio, which had been buzzing with activity, seemed quiet, not because anyone had signaled for silence, but because some truths command attention without asking for it. 3 tours, Steve repeated slowly. His voice had changed, no longer the game show host, but something softer, more reverent. "Thank you for your service, brother." "Thank you, sir." Steve studied him for a moment. "You stay in touch with your unit? The guys you served with?" Something flickered across James's face, pain so quick and sharp that if you blinked, you would have missed it. "No, sir. Lost touch after we came home." "That happen a lot?" "More than you'd think." James's jaw tightened. "Sometimes it's easier to move forward if you're not constantly looking back." Steve nodded slowly, but his eyes held questions. He started to say something else, then stopped. The stage manager was signaling. Time to resume. But Steve Harvey, who had perfected the art of reading people over 4 decades in entertainment, knew he was missing something. Knew there was a story beneath the surface. He just didn't know yet that the story was already in motion. The game resumed. Question after question, answer after answer. The Thompsons were winning, their score climbing steadily. But James kept doing that thing, that quick glance toward the audience, his eyes scanning faces he couldn't see clearly under the stage lights, looking for something, or maybe hoping he wouldn't find it. In the audience, Rodriguez sat in the 5th row, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Next to him was Chen, who had flown in from Texas and hadn't slept in 36 hours because every time he closed his eyes, he saw James's face from 20 years ago, younger, scared, trying to pretend he wasn't. 2 rows back sat Martinez, now a father of 3, who had named his youngest son James and never told anyone why. And in the very back, Washington sat with his arms crossed, his medic's instinct still sharp, watching James's body language and recognizing all the signs of a man barely holding it together. They had planned to wait until after the game. That was the agreement with the producers. Let the family play, let them have their moment, then bring them on stage during the final segment. Neat. Controlled. Television ready. But watching James up there, seeing the way he held himself, the way his eyes kept searching, and the way his voice remained steady, but his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. Rodriguez felt something crack open in his chest. 20 years. They had waited 20 years to tell him he wasn't alone. How much longer should they wait? Steve was setting up the next question when he noticed something unusual. A man in the 5th row had stood up. Then another. Then 2 more. 4 men, all roughly the same age, all with the same bearing, that unmistakable military posture, were making their way toward the stage. Security started to move, but the producers in the control booth were frantically signaling, "Let them through. Let them through." Steve Harvey stopped mid-sentence, his microphone lowered slowly. He looked at the 4 men approaching, then at James, whose back was still to the audience, who hadn't seen anything yet. And in that moment, Steve Harvey, master entertainer, comedian, host understood. He didn't know the details, didn't know the history, but he understood enough. "James," Steve said quietly. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, but his microphone caught every word. "James, I need you to turn around." James's expression was confused. "Sir, trust me, brother. Turn around." And James Thompson, who had spent 20 years not turning around, not looking back, not revisiting, not remembering, finally did. The first thing James saw was Rodriguez. Not the Rodriguez from his memories, the 22-year-old kid with the too loud laugh and the cocky grin who could diffuse tension with a single joke. This Rodriguez was 43, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years lived hard. But the eyes were the same. Those eyes that had watched the same sunrises over the same desert. Those eyes that had seen the same things James had seen and could never unsee. Time stopped. That's not a metaphor. That's not poetic exaggeration. In that moment, on that stage, with 300 people watching and cameras rolling and lights blazing, time actually stopped. The world narrowed to 4 faces walking toward him. 4 faces he knew better than his own. 4 faces he had tried for 20 years to stop seeing every time he closed his eyes. "No," James whispered. The word came out broken, disbelieving. "No, that's not." But it was. Behind Rodriguez came Chen, and James felt his knees begin to buckle. Chen, who used to read his grandmother's letters in Mandarin first, then translate them into English, his voice soft and homesick. Chen, who had been the youngest in the squad and was now a man, wearing glasses and a button-down shirt that looked too formal for his usual style. And Martinez. God, Martinez. The last time James had seen him, Martinez had been holding a photograph of his newborn daughter, memorizing her face from a picture because he'd never actually held her. Now Martinez was crying openly, not even trying to hide it, tears streaming down his face as he walked toward the stage. And Washington. The medic, the one who had held pressure on wounds that couldn't be saved, who had whispered comfort to dying boys, who had done CPR on men who were already gone because giving up wasn't an option. Washington's face was set in that same expression of determined compassion he'd always had, but his eyes were glistening. James's hands came up to his face. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. The posture he had maintained so perfectly, the military bearing, the control, the composure shattered completely. His shoulders began to shake. A sound emerged from his throat that wasn't quite a word, wasn't quite a cry, but something primal and raw and 20 years overdue. Steve Harvey stepped back, giving them space, but his own eyes were already wet. The studio audience had gone completely silent. Not the stunned silence of surprise, but the sacred silence of witnessing something holy. People were crying who didn't even understand what they were watching. They just knew it mattered. Rachel Thompson, standing at the family podium, had her hand over her mouth. She had never met these men, but she knew their names. She had heard them whispered in nightmares, spoken with reverence on the anniversaries of losses, mentioned in conversations James thought she wasn't part of. She knew what they meant to him. And she was watching her husband, her strong, controlled, carefully composed husband, come completely undone. The 4 men reached the stage. There was no hesitation. Rodriguez got there first and didn't stop, didn't pause, just wrapped his arms around James and held on like he was afraid James might disappear if he let go. "Brother," he said, his voice thick, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we waited this long." James couldn't speak. He could only hold on, his hands gripping Rodriguez's shirt, his face buried in his friend's shoulder, his entire body shaking with sobs he'd been holding back for 2 decades. Then Chen was there, and Martinez, and Washington, all of them pressing close, arms wrapping around each other, creating a circle that had been incomplete for far too long. They weren't thinking about the cameras. They weren't thinking about the audience. They weren't thinking about anything except this moment, this impossible, beautiful, devastating moment of coming home. Steve Harvey stood 10 feet away, and for the first time in his career, he had no words. His face was wet. His expensive suit jacket was wrinkled where he kept wiping his eyes. He looked at the control booth, at the producers, and gestured, "Keep rolling. Don't stop. This matters more than any game." The studio audience was weeping collectively. Strangers held hands. Grown men openly sobbed. Women clutched their hearts. Because what they were witnessing wasn't about military service or patriotism or any abstract concept. It was about love. Pure, uncomplicated, profound love between people who had been to hell together and survived. I thought. James finally managed to speak, his voice breaking on every word. I thought you all blamed me for living, for coming home when they didn't. What? Martinez pulled back, his hands gripping James's shoulders, forcing eye contact. Brother, no, never. We never blamed you. We blamed ourselves, Chen said quietly. His voice carried that same gentle quality it always had, even when it was shaking with emotion. Every single one of us. We all thought we should have done more, should have been faster, should have been the one instead. Washington, the medic, nodded. I replayed every moment, every decision, every second, wondering what I missed, what I could have done differently. I couldn't call you, Rodriguez said, his words tumbling out fast. I picked up the phone 1,000 times, but I was so ashamed. Ashamed that I survived. Ashamed that I wasn't strong enough to carry it alone. Ashamed that I needed you but was too scared to say it. I needed you too, James whispered. Every day. Every single day. We know, Martinez said. We all did. That's why we're here. Because 20 years is long enough to carry this alone. Something was happening. Something transformative. You could see it in James's face, the way the lines around his eyes softened, the way his breathing started to even out, the way his body began to relax for the first time since he'd walked on stage. Healing doesn't happen in an instant, but sometimes forgiveness does. Sometimes grace arrives in the form of 4 men who flew across the country to say, "You are not alone. You never were." Steve Harvey finally found his voice, though it was rough and unsteady. How long has it been since you all seen each other? 20 years, Washington answered. Almost to the day. 20 years, Steve repeated, his voice filled with wonder and pain. He looked at the 5 men brothers by choice, by circumstance, by bonds forged in fire, and shook his head slowly. You know what breaks my heart? That you all spent 20 years thinking you were alone, that you all carried the same guilt, the same shame, the same grief, and none of you knew the others felt it too. We were scared, Chen said simply. Scared that talking about it would make it real. Scared that we'd fall apart. Scared that the only way to survive was to forget. But you can't forget, James said. You never forget. No, Rodriguez agreed. You don't. But maybe we were wrong about what surviving means. Maybe it doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe it means remembering together. The audience was beyond applause now. This wasn't entertainment. This was testimony. This was church. This was 5 men standing in front of the world and choosing healing over hiding. Emma Thompson, James's teenage daughter, was crying as she watched her father. She had grown up with the shadow of his service, with the nightmares she heard through walls, with the sadness she saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. And now she was watching that shadow lift, just a little. Watching her father be held by people who understood him in ways she never could. Dorothy, James's mother, had her hand over her heart. She had sent her son to war 3 times, had prayed every night for his safe return, had gotten her prayers answered, but had watched him come home carrying wounds no mother could heal. And now, finally, she was seeing someone else share the weight. I have something I need to say, James said suddenly. His voice was stronger now, steadier. He looked at each of his brothers in turn. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I disappeared. I'm sorry I let fear keep me away. I'm sorry I wasted 20 years we could have had together. We all did, Martinez said. We all made the same choice. We all let the same fear win. Not anymore, Washington said firmly. We're done with that. We're done carrying this alone. Done, Rodriguez echoed. Done, Chen agreed. And James, for the first time in 20 years, smiled, not the careful, controlled smile he showed the world, but something real and broken and beautiful. Done. Steve Harvey wiped his face with both hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every father, every friend, every human being who has watched someone they love finally find peace. This right here? This is what it's all about. Not the game, not the points, Not any of it. This, love, brotherhood, showing up for each other. This is what matters. The 5 men stood together, arms still around each other, and the studio felt less like a television set and more like sacred ground. Because sometimes, healing happens in the most unlikely places. Sometimes grace shows up on a Wednesday afternoon in October. Sometimes the people you need most walk back into your life exactly when you've stopped believing they will. And sometimes, just sometimes, 20 years isn't too late. The episode never aired in its original form. The producers knew immediately that what they had captured was too important, too raw, too sacred to edit down into a standard game show format. Instead, they created a special hour-long program titled Brothers in Arms, a Family Feud reunion. It aired on Veterans Day, 6 weeks after that October afternoon. The response was seismic. Within hours, the video had been viewed tens of millions of times. Comments flooded in from every corner of the world. Veterans who had lost touch with their units reached out to old friends. Families who had watched their loved ones struggle in silence finally understood they weren't alone. Therapists shared it with patients. VA hospitals played it in waiting rooms. Military bases screened it during mental health awareness events. But the numbers don't capture what really happened. The real story is in the individual lives that changed. A Marine Corps veteran in Ohio named Michael Torres had been planning his own death for weeks. He had the method chosen, the note written, the date circled on his calendar. He was watching television at 2 a.m., unable to sleep like always, when he stumbled across a clip of James Thompson breaking down in his brother's arms. Michael watched it 7 times in a row. Then he picked up his phone and called his former squad leader, a man he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. They talked until sunrise. Michael is still alive today. He credits 5 strangers on a game show stage with saving his life. An Army spouse in Georgia named Jennifer Martinez, no relation to the Martinez from James's unit, had spent 10 years watching her husband disappear into silence. She had tried everything, suggested everything, begged him to talk to his old friends from Afghanistan. He always refused. Until he saw the episode. He cried for 3 hours, then asked Jennifer to help him find them. 6 months later, his entire platoon reunited in Atlanta. Jennifer says her husband laughs now, really laughs. The kind of laughter she thought was gone forever. The 5 men, James, Rodriguez, Chen, Martinez, and Washington, made a pact that day on stage. Never again. Never again would they let years pass without speaking. Never again would they carry their burdens alone. Never again would guilt and shame keep them apart. They started meeting every quarter, not for anything formal, no agendas or schedules, just 5 men sitting together, remembering aloud, honoring the fallen by refusing to let their own lives be consumed by survivors' guilt. They talk about the brothers they lost, all 5 of them now, their names spoken with reverence instead of whispered with pain. They talk about marriages and children and jobs and ordinary life. They talk about therapy and medication and bad days and good days. They talk about everything and nothing, and they answer their phones when one of them calls at 3 a.m. Rachel Thompson says her husband is different now. Not healed. Healing isn't linear, isn't permanent, isn't something you achieve and keep. But different. He sleeps better. He smiles more. He lets her in when the darkness comes instead of locking her out. On their kitchen wall hangs a photograph from that day, 5 men embracing on a stage, their faces wet with tears, their bodies pressed together in a circle that had been broken too long. Emma Thompson wrote her college application essay about watching her father be held by his brothers. She wrote about courage, about vulnerability, about the strength it takes to admit you can't do it alone. She was accepted to every school she applied to. She's studying social work now, specializing in veteran support services. Steve Harvey kept his promise too. He stayed in touch. He calls James on Veterans Day every year. He attended the first reunion of the full platoon, not just the 5 who had been there, but every surviving member they could find. 18 men in total, gathering in Pittsburgh for a weekend that felt like coming home. Steve showed up with his camera crew not to film, but to witness, to honor, to remember with them. The video still circulates every Veterans Day, every Memorial Day, every time someone needs a reminder that healing is possible, That brotherhood matters. That love doesn't have an expiration date. That 20 years of silence can be broken by a single moment of courage. Mental health organizations report that veteran suicide hotline calls spike every time the clip goes viral, not because it triggers despair, but because it offers hope. Because men and women who thought they were alone suddenly realize they aren't. That the people who understand them best might be one phone call away. That shame is a liar. That guilt doesn't have to be a life sentence. James Thompson still has hard days. Days when the memories are too loud. Days when the guilt whispers that he doesn't deserve joy. But on those days, his phone rings. Rodriguez checking in. Chen sending a text. Martinez sharing a photo of his kids. Washington calling just to say he's thinking about him. Because that's what brothers do. They show up. They hold on. They refuse to let each other fall. The Thompson family never did finish their game that day. The points didn't get tallied. The prizes didn't get awarded. But nobody cared. Because what happened on that stage was worth more than any game show prize could ever be. It was worth more than money or fame or recognition. It was redemption. It was grace. It was proof that it's never too late to reach out. Never too late to say, I need you. Never too late to come home. And sometimes, just sometimes, a game show becomes a sanctuary. A stage becomes sacred ground. And 5 men standing together remind the world that we were never meant to carry our burdens alone. Sometimes, television doesn't just entertain, it heals. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.